The following podcast is offered freely through the Insight Meditation Community of Washington and by Jonathan Foust. To learn more or to make a donation to support this work, please go to www.jonathanfoust.com.
So the Unitarian Church here in Arlington, which has graciously hosted our gathering for these many years, is celebrating kind of a new beginning, kind of a revival of what they're calling a church without walls. There's some very cool initiatives that are going on with Reverend Aaron as the senior minister being installed this week. And I encourage you to check out what they're doing. There's some information out in the lobby if you'd like to check that out after class. And kind of honoring this concept of church without walls, we're offering a talk this week, and when I'm away next week, Trudy will be here talking about the practicing of the precepts as a form of service. So I thought, as I was thinking about this topic, there's a little story I thought I would read to you from my friend Katie Whalen, who has written something called The Lightning Notes, which is a weekly publication of her stories. And it's entitled, What Gorgeous George Recognized in Duluth. Gorgeous George was a household name. The 250-pound professional wrestler with bleached blonde pin curls emerged in arenas with pomp and circumstance on the loudspeakers. He wore orchid-colored costumes and drove an orchid-colored Cadillac. In the ring, he power-slammed, he headlocked, and he eye-gouged. What does that have to do with our topic? And America, coming out of World War II, coming into home TV sets, loved it. One evening in Duluth, Minnesota, Gorgeous George and his entourage paid a visit to the National Guard Armory. It was where all the big acts came: traveling preacher revivals, the circus, boxing matches. That evening, a kid named Bob Zimmerman was performing on a makeshift stage in the lobby. Mr. Zimmerman was not a big act. He was not a household name. In a few years, he would change his last name to Dylan. He would write "Blowin' in the Wind," but not yet. At the Armory in Duluth, he was a kid playing in his hometown when Gorgeous George exploded in. And Gorgeous George, in a fur-lined cape, surrounded by women carrying roses, looked at Mr. Zimmerman. He winked at Mr. Zimmerman, and he appeared to say to Mr. Zimmerman, "You're making it come alive." Years later, Mr. Dillon, formerly Mr. Zimmerman, wrote in Chronicles, "Whether Gorgeous George really said it or not didn't matter. It's what I thought I heard him say that mattered. It was the recognition and encouragement that I would need for years to come. It's ordinary to pass people, performers, and riskers by, but Gorgeous George wasn't ordinary, and neither are we. Let's speak up when we're moved, write a note when we're touched. Let's let people know when they're moving the world and making it come alive." I'd like to talk a little bit about our interconnectedness, our capacity to see others and to reflect back their goodness. One of the most interesting core spiritual teachings is the practice of seeing self in other and other in self, to transcend our separateness as part of spiritual practice. So there are four things I'd like to touch on. One is how spiritual practice is designed to overcome the illusion of being separate, and how you can bridge the gap between separation to open to interconnectedness. And we'll explore a really radical meditation practice specific techniques that's designed to awaken compassion. It can be somewhat of a cathartic practice sometimes. And finally, how if you really want to make a difference in the world, your cup has to be full. How do you serve from a place of fullness and from a place of overflow? As I was reflecting on this thing we all share, this illusion that we're separate, it's referred to as one of the kleshas, one of the first mistakes that we make is this belief that we're separate. And then we go through life gathering evidence that proves that we're separate. And I remembered something that I had read years ago, and I looked it up. During World War II, a U.S. Army Brigadier General, S.L.A. Marshall, he asked average soldiers how they conducted themselves in battle. Before that, it had always been assumed that the average soldier would kill in combat simply because his country and his leaders had told him to do so, and because it might be essential to defend his own life and the lives of his friends. That was the assumption. What he didn't expect to discover was that of every 100 men along the line of fire during the combat period, an average of only 15 to 20 would take any part with their weapons. And this is something that was very pervasive in warfare, kind of Western warfare. Through the Napoleonic Wars, through World War I, and through World War II, they had a big problem. And the problem was getting their soldiers to fire at other people. Many people would simply shoot high. They'd shoot over the heads. And a phenomenon occurred during World War I, according to British Lieutenant George Ruppel. The only way he could get his men to stop firing into the air was by drawing his sword, walking down the trench, and beating them on the backside and telling them to fire low. This study was really quite a shock and quite revolutionary, and it changed the way soldiers were trained. What they found was that they had to learn how to actively desensitize soldiers so they could overcome their sensitivity and participate in the violence. They had to learn how not to feel and how not to feel responsible for their actions. So they were taught to override their own conscience. So instead of bullseye targets, they used silhouettes of human forms. They changed the language around violence. They spoke more about the honor of killing. And a lot of the language in dehumanizing was designed to dehumanize our adversaries, to see them as less than human, which made it easier to visit violence upon them. His arguments there are some controversy about his arguments and so forth, but nonetheless it had a huge impact on warfare and how we train our soldiers. And it's interesting as we reflect on that, how with your enemies, with those who annoy you, how easy it is to turn off our hearts toward them, just to see them as the other. And of course, we get to see this on display in our culture right now. Making the other the enemy, the polarization that we have in our culture, which is basically the inability to see another person's point of view. Kind of the rise of fundamentalism is basically saying, if you disagree with me, you are my enemy. So whenever we're under threat, we manage to turn off our empathy and see others as the enemy. And part of the problem is that we think we're alone and against the world. So then the question becomes, how do we heal that divide? How do we heal it personally, and how do we heal it as a culture? So an interesting phenomena, just sort of keeping with the war theme, in the first 5 months of World War I, this is 1914, the war front was between Germany and Belgium. And it was a trench warfare. And they were just kind of flat up against each other. So the effort was to outflank the other. So it became what was called the race to the sea, just sort of trying to outflank the enemy and get around. But no one had made much progress. So there was a long, long line of trenches. And the trenches were very close to each other. And as you've probably read, the trench warfare was pretty horrible. But around November of 1914, after about 5 months of living very close to each other, but in opposite trenches, the men could actually talk to each other. They could call out to each other. And they started verbally creating some informal times of truce, usually around twilight, when it was okay to go pick up your dead and bring them back. And as the trenches were so close, there was more and more conversation happening. On December 1st, a British soldier recorded a friendly visit from a German sergeant one morning who just wanted to see how they were getting on. And this half-hour truce to collect the dead bodies became extended, where soldiers would exchange newspapers with each other. And as this was going on, the authorities were getting upset. And actually, Charles de Gaulle wrote a letter of the lamentable desire of these men to not fight, and the unfortunate consequence when men become familiar with each other. That's what he wrote. And a lot of the German soldiers had lived in England, and so oftentimes they would ask about how their favorite football teams were doing. And there was one thing that seemed to make the most difference, and that in the evening that the men would sing. And in December of that year, 1914, an E.H.W. Hulse of the Scots Guard wrote home and saying he was planning a concert for Christmas Day, which would, quote, give the enemy every conceivable form of song and harmony in response to the singing that they had done for them. And in December of 1914, on Christmas Day, the Germans initiated a truce. And one of the men stuck his head above the parapet, and they started walking across toward each other in no man's land. And the men shared and traded cigarettes, cigars, buttons from their coats, pipes, newspapers, ham, schnapps, wine, cognac, and some of them played football games. You may have heard that. And one of the British corporals said how the Germans just simply disregarded all of our warnings to get down from their parapet, and they just started walking forward. And he said we couldn't shoot them in cold blood, and I don't know how we could get them to return to their business. So what I find so interesting is through that close proximity, in the midst of this sensing of the enemy, there was enough commonality that some interesting connections occurred. It's when we can begin to see ourself and the other in self, that a natural healing occurs. Now, the following year, Charles de Gaulle and the French, Adolf Hitler on the other side, forbade any sense of truce. And there was a kind of authoritarian clampdown on the common soldiers having any kind of connection. But do you recall recently the photo of Alian Kurdi, the 3-year-old Syrian boy who drowned? He was wearing a red t-shirt and shorts, and after a 15-hour boat ride, a 15-foot boat collapsed, and his 5-year-old brother Galip, his mother Rehan, died, and his father Abdullah was the only member of the family to survive. And there was something about that image that just made a profound shift in our consciousness. The recognition we could relate to the grief of the father, to the loss of his family, and it made a dramatic shift in our capacity to open to those who are suffering, those immigrants. There was something about that, I think, that it woke up our mirror neurons, our capacity to feel or imagine another suffering, and the response is a kind of a natural opening of our hearts. And that is very much the practice. That's very much our salvation. As I like to say, the good news about practicing mindfulness or non-judging awareness is it become more sensitive. The bad news is that you become more sensitive. But we become more sensitive to our own disquiet. But naturally, we become more sensitive to the disquiet and suffering of others. We more naturally begin to sense self and other in self. And opening to this suffering is not easy. I'd spoken earlier of a syndrome which has been studied quite thoroughly called compassion fatigue, where you can only take so much before you have to shut down. It's a natural part of the human experience. But when we can truly feel and empathize with another person, there's a stirring of the heart. In fact, the Buddha described it as the quivering of the heart in response to suffering. And the courage that's required to open to feel that is quite transformative. So I'd like to share with you a technique, a meditation practice, which is sometimes a challenging practice. You have to self-monitor in the practice. And because it is not about turning away from suffering, it's actually turning toward suffering. Rather than hiding from it, you actually see suffering as a vehicle for transformation. So it's a method for connecting with suffering, a method for developing your capacity to overcome fear, and a method for dissolving a guarded heart and awakening the inherent compassion that's in there. I'll tell you a little bit about how it works, and then we'll practice it together. The first thing you do is you take a little bit of time to establish a sense of presence. So to do some concentration practice to calm the mind. And then you'll bring into someone who you know is suffering or in pain. And it's nice to start with someone who you feel intimate with. Someone that it's kind of easy to feel compassion for. And you bring into someone, not only someone who's suffering, but someone for whom you would like to offer some help. And you begin to use the breath in this meditation. And as you breathe in, you open to their stress, you open to their suffering, and that wish to take away their suffering. And as you breathe out, you send out a sense of calm, a sense of relaxation, a sense of happiness, a sense of whatever would relieve their pain. And this is the core of the practice. You breathe in others' pain so that they can be well. And you breathe out, sending them relaxation or whatever you sense would bring them a sense of relief and a sense of happiness. It's a beautiful practice. It's kind of counterintuitive. And it's very challenging. And one of the reasons why is because it forces you to come in contact with your own pain and your own suffering. This has a way of not only highlighting but magnifying your own pain and your own suffering. And when you hit a threshold of where it's challenging, there's a very interesting technique that I found very helpful. And in essence, what it is simply reminding yourself that other people feel this too. That when you are caught in any sense of feeling tight or in fear, to remember that of the billions of people on the planet, that there are probably millions who are feeling exactly the same way. And by opening it to our collective experience, it has a very powerful way of opening the frame of whatever you may be experiencing that's between you and feeling happy or free. Maybe you can name it: anger or revulsion or judgment or revenge. But you breathe in for all the people who are feeling that. And you send out relief or whatever you would imagine would help to heal. Sometimes you can name it. You can name some texture or some quality of that suffering or emotion or pain. Sometimes you can't find a name for it. It's just sort of a felt sense of feeling at ease or feeling at dis-ease. But the practice is the same. You breathe in for all those who are feeling this. You breathe out whatever you feel or imagine would offer some help or some relief. So this practice is described in some ways as going against the grain. Why would you turn your attention specifically to pain and suffering? Well, what this practice can do is it can dissolve the armor of self-protection. It can dissolve clinging. It can reverse the logic of avoiding suffering and seeking pleasure. And it can open you to the spaciousness of the heart, to a bigger dimension of who you are. This can be a tremendous practice to do for those who are dying or those who have died. You can do it as a formal practice. You can do it right on the spot of just seeing someone who's suffering and just to breathe in, acknowledge their suffering, and breathe out whatever you would feel, might imagine would help to heal or soothe that person. So if you'd like to practice this for a little bit, I'll offer some guidance and I'll give you some space to explore this on your own. So you might let your attention come into the breath or the awareness of sound or the feeling in the body. And we'll take a little time for some concentration practice just to arrive and land. And in your own way, feel wherever the breath is most predominant right now. And feel the aliveness, the vibration of sound. And this feeling tone of your body. There are many different ways of practicing this meditation, which is known as Tonglen. Some include using visualization. I prefer for it to be just more kinesthetic. But you might now bring into mind just one person that you know that may be struggling or suffering or in pain in some way. And take a few moments to imagine them, to sense them. And let your attention connect with the breath, and in your own way, with the in-breath, just feel and acknowledge and sense their suffering. On the out-breath, offer them some peace or relaxation or whatever you feel might ease their suffering. And for this next minute or so, let this be your practice. Breathe in, feel, and sense their suffering. And breathe out an offering of relaxation, of healing. And you might explore another element of this practice as you just continue with the eyes closed. You might reflect on whatever is going in your life that is between you and feeling at peace or happy or free. Any anxiety or fear, perhaps any physical pain that you may be dealing with, any struggle that you may be in right now. And you might reflect on all those that may be experiencing something very similar. And as you breathe in, to acknowledge this shared experience of suffering. And as you breathe out, to offer some sense of peace, of healing, of relaxation. Whatever may offer some form of healing. If there are others who spontaneously come to mind over these next 2 minutes, continue with the practice, experiment. Breathing in, acknowledging, I see your pain. On the out-breath, I care for this. And you might now, if you like, release the technique and just relax and feel what may have shifted in these last minutes of practice. What do you feel? And can you be with this? And if you like, you can deepen the breath. And feel free to remain with the eyes closed. If you like, you can let your eyes open. I find this to be a difficult practice and a courageous practice because it is deeply sensitizing. When I drive down from Great Falls, I come down North Glebe, and there's a corner there where there are oftentimes people asking for money with signs, and it's so easy to avert one's eyes. But I've really made it a practice to make contact. And just the courage, personally, to simply just to feel their experience, like, oh my, what must that be like? To be standing on the corner. What is that life like? While it's a challenging practice, it's also a very direct practice for dissolving separation. To see self and other in self. And for me to recognize how different would my life have to be in that situation, to be in those shoes. There are many ways and many practices that are designed to dissolve the self. And this is a very direct path. It can be done as a formal practice. It can be a very powerful thing to do at the end of your meditation practice, just to reflect on someone who's suffering, to use the breath to open to the suffering and to offer peace. It's a very powerful practice for self-soothing, and something that I have found to be tremendously healing in my grief and loss, to remind myself that other people feel this too, and to breathe into that. It's really quite extraordinary. And it's something you can do right on the spot. Just sensing someone is having a hard day, just to see them and really sense what their experience is and just to wish them well. The practice is designed to open you to what are called the immeasurables, which is the capacity of compassion, and 4 specific qualities of the heart that as the self becomes less rigid, you find that your capacity for kindness toward yourself and others expands to limitlessness. Your capacity for compassion for yourself and for others. Your capacity for joy for yourself and for others. And your capacity for equanimity. And equanimity is a quality of steadiness. That in all the wild fluctuations of your life, that there is a quality of steadiness, a quality of presence that can pervade those fluctuations for yourself as well as for others. And so when we sense the suffering around us in a very sincere and authentic way, there is, as the Buddha said, a quivering of the heart. There is a natural response to that. And it's very easy to find yourself slipping into action without any sense of renewal. So I love the particular teaching of serving in your life, serving your relationships, serving your commitments, but doing it from a place where you are not only full, but your cup is overflowing. One of my most clear experiences of this is when I was in college. I was living on a farm and co-managing a 1,000-acre farm all through college, and I was trying to hook up this piece of farm equipment. I'm not a naturally gifted mechanic, but I grew up on a farm. I can fake it. But I was working on this equipment, and I could not figure out how this belt ran through. I was getting more and more frustrated, and I actually kicked the tires of the tractor. I was so angry. And then I realized that it was time for my meditation. I was meditating twice a day for 20 minutes. I was doing transcendental meditation at that time. I went off and I did my 20 minutes. I came back, I looked at it, and it was like, oh, that goes there, that goes there, that goes there. What I had spent an hour swearing at machinery, I figured out in 2 seconds because I had shifted my consciousness. I'm just curious, does anyone feel like you're serving from a place of burnout, kind of chronic fatigue, tiredness? Yeah. When you're serving from a place of tiredness, or running on fumes, you have a certain degree of effectiveness. When you're serving from a place of deep relaxation, while being alert, it's a very different quality, as you may know. I know from the standpoint of writing, if I'm working on a project, there are times I can be working on something for 4 hours and slaving over it, but if I'm in flow mode, it just comes right through. I'm amazed at how easy it is. Quite often over the years, I've had people say, man, yoga and meditation is so self-indulgent. I mean, how narcissistic can it possibly be? And my response is always, whatever it takes to get your cup full and overflowing, that's actually your responsibility. That's how you serve the world. I was leading a retreat. This was, I think, last year. There was a young woman who came to the retreat. This was a weekend retreat. It was her first time away from her two kids, her two very small girls, and she was freaked out about leaving them, but she knew they were in good hands, and she got a broke silence to check in, see how they were doing. But the retreat was so powerful for her. She had so many insights, and so she went home just like floating on a cloud. And about 3 months later, she was back. And I saw her, I said, my God, you're back already. And she said, when I left that retreat, I felt so good. I was so present and alive and effective. And then it started to fade. And then one morning, my two girls came up to me and they said, Mommy, that place you went away to before, you might want to go back there again. To be effective in the world, we have to open our hearts. And to open our hearts, we have to be relaxed. And we have to have energy. Of the 7 faculties of awakening, there's 7 faculties that kind of need to be there to awaken or be in any transformational process. One of them is energy. You have to have energy. You've got to have fuel in order to, not just to keep your nostrils above waterline, but to be effective and be awake and keep your heart open in the world. So it's a very a very important and critical inquiry to ask yourself, what is the optimal environment for you, where you can be both rested and alert, have your heart open and have your energy flowing. It's a very important part of living a conscious and awakened life. So why don't we close with a short meditation, and I have a little poem for you. In the midst of this world with so much churning, so much suffering, when we look for how to be at peace and effective in the world, it comes from only one place. These words are from Dorothy Hunt. Do you think peace requires an end to war? Or tigers eating only vegetables? Does peace require an absence from your boss, your spouse, yourself? Do you think peace will come from some other place than here? Some other time than now? In some other heart than yours? Peace is this moment without judgment. That is all. This moment in the heart-warming space where everything that is welcome. Peace is this moment without thinking that it should be some other way, that you should feel some other thing, that your life should unfold according to your plans. Peace is this moment without judgment. In this moment in the heart space where everything that is welcome. In these final moments, you might take this time to wish yourself well, to imagine your path filled with a sense of ease and well-being. And imagine your opening an open heart, radiating in all directions to all beings, including yourself. And you might like to close by bringing your hands in prayer position in front of your heart and just tuck the chin slightly, just offering a sense of thanks for yourself, for that which is guiding you through this life. And deepening the breath, if you like, you might let your eyes open and just take a moment to acknowledge the person to your right and left and to wish them well. Thank you so much. One of the ways that we can find peace within ourselves and peace in the world, we were talking about fuel and energy. That's why we have cookies. They're waiting for you. If you'd like to be on the mailing list, you can sign up. As always, thank you for your generous support for the class. Trudy will be here next week. I'll be on retreat. Have a wonderful time, and I'll see you soon.